Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest Daugherty Roundtable Talk. I'm Tim Hunsicker, and today's topic is quality engineering in agile transformations. Let me introduce you to your panelists today. Let me start with myself. My name's Tim. I've been in the QA workspace for, well, specifically quality engineering and automation for the last 25 some odd years in all kinds of industries. Martin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Martin Zaegel. I have been in the quality engineering world, specifically in test automation for about 15 years now, between the rental car business and medical.
Great. Tim Coffey, why don't you introduce yourself to us?
Hey, my name's Tim Coffey. Been in QA for about 22 years now. The last 15 of those years devoted to automation. I worked in the insurance, finance, background services, healthcare industries. I've been with Daugherty now for 6 months.
Great. Josh, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Joshua Renth. I am a 10-year veteran, mostly a backend API Java developer, with the last 3 years being here with Daugherty.
Excellent. So let's start with what things looked like before Agile became the way that people worked. In the waterfall world, there were definitely different ways that we did things. Tim, can you tell us a little bit about how things were with testing mostly being done at the end of the development cycle?
Yeah, sure. So before Agile, companies used a process called waterfall methodology. This method was linear or sequential, and it put testing at the project's later stages. This approach was risky because it deferred testing, meaning the testers had to wait to know if their code introduced bugs. Creating automation tests in this process was challenging as well because we were usually given a complete piece of code and fixes took longer to implement as bugs had to go back through the process. Often the automation tech debt was so great that it was just seen as a waste of time to revisit it. And if the window, if the deadline for the project was immovable, and the devs needed more time, then the testing window became shorter. Sometimes testing phases were skipped altogether. Another major disadvantage was the dev and test teams worked separately. After the requirements walked through, the testing team did not know how the code would look until it was turned over to us. We used to call this throwing code over the wall because what we received was often unexpected and more often blew away the test plan that the QA had spent weeks or months crafting. I think the main detriments to testing were the disconnected way the teams worked.
So yeah, you spoke a little bit about how the kind of siloing that would happen there. Josh, can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so big red flag when it comes to siloing. Just look for these slogans out there. Is this ready to go to QA? It's done when QA says it's done. Is the code deployed? We're just waiting on QA to sign off. They're the last stop. Right there, you've got siloing. Your developers and your QA, they're not working together. Your developers are just seeing QA as testers, and we don't want QA to be seen as testers. We want them to see more as our quality coaches. And so you actually can even have more siloing before that. A big red flag to look for is when you go to your sprint planning, if you're seeing a story for the very first time, you now have a silo before you're even gets to development. You have a silo between your product owner, stakeholders, and the development team.
Excellent. So Martin, with this, there in the waterfall world, there was definitely a very specific types of tests that people would use. There were types of, the test pyramid was what everyone would think about back then. Can you tell us a little bit about what the test pyramid in the waterfall world would look like?
Yes, so with the test pyramid in the waterfall world, we'd like to consider that almost like representing an ice cream cone. And so at the very bottom of your ice cream cone, that's where you normally have like your unit test. There'd be very little across the code, and which would restrict how quickly test and certification of your new code would work. And then as we worked up that cone, we have our integration test where we can start getting a little bit more of the interactions between the components of your applications, between the databases and to the logic of your application that you're trying to implement. and pulling data from different areas. As we got up a little bit higher, we'd have a lot more of our automation tests, and those would take weeks to months to execute or even just develop, because we did not get that code until the very end. And so there was no way to start implementing your new tests that you want to execute for your testing for those new features coming along. And then at the very top, we'd have our manual tests. Those would be like your journey stories. So pretty much most of your testing for that specific iteration that you're developing for your features, you spend most of your time doing your manual testing, because there was just no way to implement all your test automation to cover all those scenarios when you get the code at the very end.
Right. So this is kind of where Agile comes in. And the idea is let's kind of get rid of these big monolithic projects, and let's try to move things in a better way, where we're doing more, faster, better tests. Tim, can you talk to us a little bit about how the idea of shift left can kind of address the issues that you brought up before around testing at the end?
Yeah, sure. So shifting left is a major improvement in software development. If you picture what I was discussing earlier about the flow of software development, it's read left to right. You have planning, design, develop, test, deploy. Shift left means moving the testing earlier into those phases and no longer waiting until the end to start the testing. Testers then can bring their knowledge into the discussion of a new feature. This can aid in the collaboration around new features and discuss the best way to implement them. This could help the whole team understand what's being asked of them, and we can assure quality from the beginning instead of trying to control quality at the end. It helps the teams test early and test often. One of the issues with waterfall is having to wait until the end, and the code is no longer fresh on the minds of the developers. With shift left, we can as testing earlier and testing often, we can turn those defects back over to the devs quickly, and they can respond quickly with a fix. Automation is no longer shell testers on some teams or even writing unit tests. This type of testing is not just for testers, though, because you can utilize code checkers and static analysis tools to show coding mistakes before code is even deployed. Even the type of design language used, such as test-driven or behavior-driven development, can help verify and validate code, make sure that it's understood by all stakeholders. And these design languages can even lend to the creation of integration automation. Shift left helps break down walls, and it's truly a collaboration with the whole team.
Excellent. So, and breaking down walls, one great thing. Another thing is breaking down these silos. Josh, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the tricks that we have to break down these silos that you talked about earlier?
Yeah. So the key is the buzzword there, right? Shift left. So let's start. Let's go way left. Let's start all the way at the beginning of the story. Have the three amigos present. Who are the three amigos if you've never heard of it? Product owner, a developer, and a member of QA. Get the quality built in as the story is being written. Make it a genuine conversation between the group and not just the product owner telling the team, hey, I need this, please do this, get this done. Get that acceptance criteria driven by QA. Have the developers ask questions of unexpected and expected behavior. Personally, I strive for when we're creating a story, let's think of the three paths. Let's get a happy path. Let's get an alternative path, how I'm going to get there. And what's a sad path when something goes wrong? Bonus points, if as you're talking about those, you write them in Gherkin style, write them in that given, when, then. Like Tim just said, now we've got some BDD, we got some behavioral driven development going on. So during the development, pair up with QA for that first line of code, not the last line of code, the first line of code. Talk about how are we going to turn this acceptance criteria that we have into automation tests? Can I take those and use those to write my behavioral tests of, say, for instance, my APIs? Well, now I'm doing TDD. Now I'm doing test-driven development. You're shifting left. You're doing BDD. You're doing TDD. You got the buzzword bingo going there. When you take those Gherkin-style scenarios, you're giving yourself a blueprint for success. Pair up with QA on a call. Run the automation suite against what you're building. Walk through the tests that drove the development. Work together. Collaborate. You're a team. The story isn't done when QA says it's done. The story should be done when the developer says it's done. because they gain the confidence of delivering that working software. That's what we're trying to do with Agile, deliver working software. Remove QA as a tester from your vocabulary. I hate calling QA testers. They're not testers. They are our quality coach, like I mentioned before. They're not a quality tester.
Excellent. So now you've got these silos broken down. You've got testing throughout. What do these new tests look like? What is the state of the new test pyramid for us, Martin?
Yes. So as we mentioned earlier, we represented the test pyramid as an ice cream cone. Well, we want to flip that ice cream cone upside down. We want to have, depending upon maturity of your application, 80, 90, 95% of your application is being tested from unit tests. Those are your quickest tests that can execute. They're testing out the functionality of the application. You're not having to wait for getting all the code pushed out to identify if there's a bug in some of your new development. And then as we move our way up, we have our component contract testing. And so that allows you to start getting more and more into the integration between your code that you just developed and an application or another API that exists in your organization. And as we get up a little bit higher, you get a little bit more into your API testing and integration testing to where you can test like a flow of different APIs together. And those are still pretty quick, but there's still a lot of maintenance and time to develop those to go with them. And at the very top, you have your GUI, API, and test automate UI testing to go with those. And so those is where you can start getting into, I want to query a database to get some data, use that data, that query to populate for any other data I need downstream another test. And so we want to try to reduce as much of that as we can, because those are super heavy in maintenance and they take a while to execute and maintenance on them. And then at the very top, we want that to be our exploratory testing. So we're just going out in your application, trying different things out and seeing how the behavior of the application is working. And so you don't have any types of scripted test. You're just out there clicking around, seeing what happens.
And with the silos broken down, that can be anyone doing this kind of exploratory testing, right? You can have your product owners, or you can have your developers, anyone who just plays around and sees what happens. That's great. So we've got, in this new Agile world, we've got testing early, we've got the group working as a whole, and we've got this new set of tests. What is the future? What does this look like in an ideal world for us, Martin?
Yes, so like an ideal world, we want to try to build CI/CD into our testing and development and pushing our code through the different environments. And so what I mean by that is, like, I want to have a smoke test that can be triggered when a developer pushes their code into the development branch. And so that's just moving it one level up, which allows us to start getting into some different testing that's not just on my local machine. And then with those CI/CD scripts, if everything passes and we have that continuous development and continuous integration in place, if everything passes there, that can move up into the next level to where I want to deploy to the test environment, which allows us to execute our regression test and some other tests that we want to have executed. And if everything passes there, then we can even look at moving those tests up into a UAT environment, and if your application doesn't have that set up, even up into production. And you can have smoke tests and different types of tests for each one of these environments. And all these tests can be different between the type of test that you need per environment. You can utilize integration test as well as those BDD tests that were discussed earlier.
Excellent. So we've talked about the past, we talked about the future. Let's talk about some of the traps that you might see along the way in these transformations from this waterfall world to an idealized Agile world. Josh, why don't you talk a little bit about the word handoffs and how that can be a counter indicator of really getting to good Agile, and what is a good way to think of it instead of handoffs?
So the handoff, right? So that's the whole waterfall, right? I'm going to take this, I'm going to hand it off to QA, and then QA is going to do their part, and it's going to be basically handed off to the PO. No, don't get rid of those handoffs, right? So one of the traps you fall into that to get out of that is demo early and demo often. Demo to your product early as you can. Now, demoing early isn't bad. The whole point is you want to try to get something in front of your product owner, because the whole point of Agile is you want that quick, instant feedback loop. That's what Agile is all about, fast feedback loop. I always like to use a generic story with my team. You know, for logging in, we have a story where when you log in on your birthday, we want fireworks to shoot off. It's your birthday. So as soon as our web developers, as soon as they get kind of fireworks working, something like that, they got it hooked up to the API. Let's show it. You can show it on your local machine. You can show, hey, product owner, do you like this? Are the fireworks long enough? Are they bright enough? We need sounds? We didn't really kind of have that in our acceptance criteria. Get that fast feedback from them. But the trap that you could fall into, again, with those kind of siloing, that handing off, is you've shown it to the product owner. So now you're thinking, oh, I've checked it off. The product owner accepts it. Now the code just goes out there. You didn't show them that. You showed them works on my machine. So don't do that. Show it to them early, get some feedback, continue working with QA, doing your automation, making everything's right. Like, okay, it's on their birthday. It's right at midnight that we hit that one. When they logged in right at midnight, that it does actually fire off. Pass all your automations, get it ready for release, get it deployed out to your environment. And then product owner, need you to get your final sign off on this. Here it is. We're showing you working software. Don't show them works on my machine.
Excellent. So Tim, another thing that we hear sometimes as a counter indicator of what we want is that the definition of done is the QA sign off. What is some good ways to think of that instead of definition of done equal QA sign off?
Well, I would say the definition done is not about getting any QA sign off, but actually it's approval and sign off from all shareholders involved. It's a list of what you would call value added activities that should be completed to ensure the high level of quality for any feature that you're creating. It's an artifact that is used and managed by the whole team. It's not just owned and managed by QA. So we're no longer having to get those sign-offs like we used to do in the past, where we thought QA had a lot of power. We could hold things back from going to production if we didn't agree with it. But now we have a list the whole team has agreed upon, and we can take those lists and we can compare it against whatever story or feature they're ready to put out to production. I like to think about it as they're rules, excuse me, just like rules that we would have for our kids. If we hang up the rules and they break a rule, it's not me enforcing it. These are the rules. These are the rules that we have to follow. And it's just the same way for definition of done. You could say, oh, yeah, we're going to put it there as soon as it's done testing. So it's not done then, right? Oh, well, no, it's not done. So you always have this set of rules to go back on, and it doesn't hold any one person accountable. Everybody has agreed to this. Everybody is accountable. Everybody should see that all of the activities on the definition of done are taken care of and they're met. And it really puts a lot of emphasis back onto the team as a whole and less emphasis on individual contributors. And it's a great way to run it, I believe.
Excellent. And I'm going to speak now for just a couple minutes about one of my pet peeves in here, which is the idea, I'm sure we've all seen this, where you get in and you're going through an agile transformation and the business says, oh, well, we have this huge group of user journey tests that we just want automated. It's what we've done for regression in the past, right? That we want to be able to see it the way the user does. And well, it's first of all, you're going to have to do it again. Martin talked earlier about how we want to invert the triangle, the pyramid for Agile. And if you invert the pyramid and still you're doing everything through the UI, that's going to be a problem. As he said, these UI tests are generally the most fragile. They're the ones that are going to take the longest to run. You're going to have to spend the most time actually fixing them. So what we need to do is we need to kind of move back and do some more atomic testing and get, as people said earlier, into some of this behavior driven stuff where we're actually looking at what is the behavior that we're looking at here and how do we test that atomically rather than to do it through a whole user journey. So again, the idea is that instead of automating these long steps, the classic example that I always think of is, testing an automobile's accelerator. And so you don't want to have to say, given, I get in the car, or I turn the key in the lock and open the door and get in the car and put the car or the key in the ignition and turn the ignition and put the car in gear and push the accelerator, then the car goes. Because what happens if the key in the lock doesn't work, right? Then that test won't work, but neither will the test that when I turn the steering wheel, that it actually turns the car, or that anything else, right? You're blocked on that first thing. What you want to do is you want to get it to the point where you're looking at it, that this is the atomic thing I want to actually test. How do I test that? How do I look at that behavior and actually test that behavior? With that, we're going to talk now for a minute about another contraindicator out there. Josh, what can you tell us about demoing to PO as a prerequisite to QA?
So everything we covered here, I know Martin was going back talking about the testing pyramid, and Tim, you were talking about, the whole thing with the long UI test, or, a whole test of getting in the car and 27 steps. And really all we're checking is that when I turn the key switch 2 times, it actually goes to on. Question I have is, how do we fall into that? Why is it when I go out to a new client and a new project and I look at what our testing suite's kind of like, maybe I see some unit tests, a decent amount, but then the other part is I have a lot of UI tests, and I don't kind of have that middleware, not middleware, maybe that middle ground test of, just API automation tests. It's all either unit tests in the code, or I've got all these hundreds and hundreds of UI tests. How do we fall into that? Well,
I'll jump in here for a minute. One of the things I think that led to this is that, again, this is the way things used to be, right? As Martin was saying earlier, a lot of these tests in the waterfall world were these user journey tests, right? This is what we had. And so when people went to Agile, they thought, oh, well, this is how we're going to get Agile in development. But nobody ever thought, how do we get Agile in test? So the first thing people thought was, oh, well, we'll just automate these tests so that they take less time, right? If we can shrink this 6-week testing period down to, 2 days, then we're good. But of course, that's not really addressing the problem, because as I said, you're going to run into problems with maintaining this, or you're going to run into problems with, something small changes. And so all of a sudden all your codes break. And so it does require a rethinking of how we do things. And I don't think that many places have done that. They have assumed that since we have this huge suite of regression tests, which are the user acceptance tests, the user journey tests, that's what we want. We just want to automate those. Anyone else have any ideas on that? Tim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I go along with what you said. It's a lot of has to do with the culture. To me, because in the past, in the waterfall world and things like that, the developer knew all, right? Because he or she had the perspective of the code and the requirements unlike any other, and also the manager, people looking down and seeing their staff, they agree that if the developer can get something working that it's easy to use, a login screen, so to speak, then that's the only thing we really need to test. What more could you possibly test if the developer has gotten this working? And this is I'm no way disparaging developers, very intelligent people. But what I'm getting at is that it's the culture of it's the way it's always been. Why are you digging any deeper? This is not what we ask of you. Why are you trying to be a bottleneck? And when as we come out with more and more testing methodologies, ways to bake in the quality in all aspects of all phases of the code, it's hard to kind of shift some of those older companies. Oh, and I think Tim had mentioned it too, or you might have mentioned it, Josh, is when you said that you go into a place and they already have all of this automation built around UI. Well, they don't want to just throw that all over, right? Because I mean, it took a long time to get management to buy into that in the first place because of the cost. It took a long time to build up that suite. So we paid somebody or multiple somebodies to build that suite. So, they're not going to just want to toss it. But here you come with your newfangled testing ideas, to try to muck everything up, which would actually in turn save them money in the long run. But it's always when it comes to testing and things like that, it seems to always be getting the buy-in in the long run. It's never the short run ROI that's going to buy.
Excellent. Well, that's great. I think we're running out of time here, so I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank the panel here, and thank everyone who watched this today. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.